As someone who always struggled to put on muscle when I was younger, despite always lifting weights, I eventually learned it's because I wasn't eating enough protein. But what about protein timing? What kind of timing did I use when I made a transformation from looking like this to several years later looking like this naturally? In this video, I'm gonna look at some new research on the matter, I'm gonna compare it to some old research, and try to figure out how much does timing matter and give you my exact recommendations. Now, this new research is actually pretty cool. Even though it flies in the face of what my previous bias was, I think it's really important to stay open-minded, that you could be wrong, and I've changed my mind about a lot of things in the last 16 years I've been doing this. Now, what they did in this study is they took mostly untrained individuals, had them go through a tough training session, then they gave them either 25 grams of protein or 100 grams of protein, and then they had to lie down for the next 12 hours and do literally nothing. And during that time, through different intervals, they had them go through different blood tests, biopsies, and what was really cool is they gave them tracers so they could actually physically see where the protein was going. So what I want to do now is talk about the results and what we know, and then I'll also get into what we don't know. And what we know is the rate of muscle protein synthesis was much higher in the 100 gram group versus a 25 gram group. And you might think, obviously, they're doing that much more protein, but the reason they did this is because of previous speculation from research that 25 grams was the max you could use in a meal. This is something I never really agreed with. I thought it was maybe more around 40, but not only that, it also lasted much longer. Even between the 4 and 12 hour mark, there seemed to continue to be higher levels of muscle protein synthesis. And this is actually different than what we've seen in some other studies. For instance, there was one where they infused amino acids in people for 6 hours straight, assuming that you would just keep seeing these higher levels of protein synthesis. But what they actually saw was for the first 2 hours, it increased dramatically, but then after 2 hours to 6 hours, it came back down near baseline despite the continual infusion. Now, it's possible part of the difference is this new study used a milk protein, which is like 80% casein, and casein is a much slower digesting protein. So that could at least partially be why the time of elevation lasted longer. Regardless, what a lot of people are taking from this new study is that there's no maximum anabolic response. You can basically eat as much protein, or at least up to 100, and you'll continue to increase muscle protein synthesis. And while I think this is cool and it's intriguing, and there's some takeaways from this which I'll get to, there's a lot of things that we actually don't know from this. This is going from 25 all the way up to 100 grams. Would there have been a cap at 40 grams, 50 grams, 75 grams? Like, we don't know unless you compare all those things. Another potential factor is these were untrained individuals, and untrained people will typically have a bigger response to muscle protein synthesis in a training session. We know people who are more trained will have a shorter response, so there could be something about they've never had this training before, they go through a grueling session, then they're giving this huge dose of protein, and because the body's not used to this, it could utilize it a lot more than someone who trains frequently. It's also possible you could have a better response after a workout. So maybe you're able to use more protein in that kind of post-workout period than you could during other times of the day. I'm really curious what would happen if they matched 100 grams of protein and say did one big serving of 100, or for the 25 grams did 4 servings of 25 every few hours during that 12-hour period. Would one have done better than the other? We don't really know, but that also doesn't really relate to the is there a max response in one meal. There actually is some research that looks similarly at something like this, where they had almost 100 grams of protein, but they broke it up into 2 groups where they had 3 meals. One was a low protein meal, a moderate protein meal, and a high protein meal, and the other group basically got 3 more even moderate protein servings. And in that study, the group that had 3 moderate protein intakes, even though the total was about the same, they built more muscle than the low, moderate, and high group. So now with this new information, let's talk about how much protein you should eat and what do I recommend with this new information. So first, remember, this isn't potentially saying there's no upper limit to how much protein you can use in a single day. They're just talking about one meal. So you can't just take this and say, if I eat 100 grams of protein at every meal and I do this 4 times throughout the day and eat 400 grams of protein, I'm just going to build tons of muscle. In fact, there's been research that looked at things like this, like one that looked at people eating 1 gram per pound of protein versus 2 grams per pound of protein. And even though the 2 grams per pound ate double the protein, they didn't build any more muscle because they were already above that kind of anabolic max threshold, which I'll get to in a minute. Which, side note about that study, even though that group ate double the protein and averaged 800 calories more, they didn't gain any additional body fat, which is why you often hear me say I basically look at protein as free calories. But what the study could show, if you prefer to eat bigger meals, if you're doing a OMAD approach or maybe some sort of a fasting approach where you're only getting a couple meals, you might be able to build as much muscle as long as your total intake is the same. Keeping in mind, research papers that have looked at the upper amount have concluded that it's about 0.82 grams per pound of your weight that is roughly the maximum amount of protein you can utilize for anabolism. So if you now know how much protein is the max you can use, which I actually would go above that, I'll talk about that in a minute, but what am I recommending you do with regards to protein timing? If you're someone who just wants to build some muscle, you're not overly crazy about it, and you just want to live a healthy lifestyle, then just do it however you want. You're at least going to get the majority of the results. But if you're someone more like me who wants to do everything you can to build as much muscle as possible, I still think it's going to be better to split it up more evenly, doing around 3 to 5 meals per day. I personally think 4 is a really good sweet spot, especially from a practical standpoint. Doing 5 is going to be a little bit more challenging if you're doing meals with families and things like that. The other practical application could possibly be if you can sandwich your workout between 2 meals, maybe that post-workout meal, if you're normally doing 30-40 grams, maybe you do like 50, just because you could possibly get a bit better response. But personally, I would just rather err on the side of utilizing as much protein as possible. I'm okay with possibly wasting some protein and making sure I'm maximizing the amount I can to build as much muscle as I can. So personally, I eat more around 1 gram per pound of my weight. Now, with all that being said, what about if you're in a fat loss phase? Does it work a bit differently? It does matter too how lean you are, because if you have a lot of weight to lose, saying to eat 1 gram per pound if you're obese is probably not realistic and is definitely unnecessary. Oftentimes what I recommend in those cases, just eat around 1 gram per pound of whatever your goal weight might be. But what if you want to maximize everything you can to build muscle and lose fat? Well, if you check out this video here next, I'll cover what I consider to be the perfect diet for fat loss and muscle building. So make sure you check that out next, and I'll see you in that other video.